Okay, thank you very much for your participation and for voting. We will shortly have an overview of how these votings were and what were the factors that you found the most impactful. But in the meantime, I would like to open the discussion and open more a debate session on the contents that have been presented today, and your understanding, your questions, your input would be very helpful for us. As I mentioned before, this is an ongoing work package, ongoing task that we are developing. Okay, as you can see here, we have the results on the polls. The first one was about the factors that are affecting the demand side flexibility. From the votes, what we can see is that you almost found all of them very impactful, but the majority of them still require lots of progress to be enabler. And the most, I think, factor that is behind is the customer perspective, which gives importance to the fact that more interactions with the end users, with the customer side, with the building sector needs to be taken from energy sector and from the regulatory sector to increase the awareness and encouragement of the customer. The other aspect is market access that you've mentioned that it still needs progress, but I could see that someone voted it as an enabler. I would like to know if who was the one who considered this as an enabler. If you are considering a specific country that has already the proper infrastructure, proper regulatory background for this, or what is your view on this? If you are willing to start a discussion. Okay, maybe not, because here in Europe, although there are many studies being dedicated to the activation of the demand side flexibility in the market, there are still problems that needs to be solved. Of course, some countries have taken some steps in adding flexibility, demand side flexibility into reserve market, but reaching more advanced points where actually the generation is still lagging behind. The other aspect, which is the flexibility product design, we have votes that they're considered completely preventive, which means that there is a huge lack on definition. I would like to have some discussion on that if you want to contribute or elaborate how you are seeing this as complete preventive.
People can feel free to unmute themselves or write in the chat box and I'll read out the response.
Okay, we have to move on. So I would consider that, as I mentioned, this is still needs fundamental progress on this aspect. Jessica, can we move to the next poll? Okay. Good. From the results, I can see that. So our detection on the available technologies were relatively thorough, and we have already addressed everything, and you also found them impactful and necessary for the flexibility of the building, except for micro wind turbines, which I think that is also very much understandable. So we can give less priority to adding that to our cases. Next, Paul. Okay, for the I'm going through the results. Okay. Okay, I see that the majority of votes went for the operational approach, which is also understandable because if there is also already existing flexibility or operational infrastructure for enhancing the flexibility of the building, this would be more straightforward for implementation, but of course it faces its own challenges. But at least it's not, it may not face as much of investment requirement as the retrofit approach. And the last one, oh, the next one, the fourth one.
We did have a good question to the group about the previous question, if we can go back. Are micro wind turbines efficient already, and are they financially interesting? I don't know if that's something that other people in the group want to mention. It got quite a few votes here in the low impact category.
That's why I think that's a very good question, and that's why I think it got low impact, because there are still downside to micro wind turbine inclusion on building level, namely its efficiency. But what we try to have a map of all the possibilities that we have. That's why we were counting on this poll to see, okay, probably micro wind turbines and its acceptance, its inclusion may not be a priority, unlike battery storage or PV panels.
A good question. All right, great. We can go ahead
to the fourth poll. The impact of factors affecting the quantification of the flexibility. The baseline methodology, of course, has a very high impact, but we still have votes on low impact on the baseline methodology. I am very much interested to see, to have some kind of discussion on that, because the baseline methodology is a challenge. Not only for the contracting phase, but also for the measurement and verification. Okay, and the rest were, of course, the availability and the granularity of the data are very important factors, as well as being also the votes confirm that. The final poll, Jess. To deploy demand-side flexibility as a service. Okay, I see that the majority of votes showing the impact of designing innovative ancillary services, which is actually the part that is missing when we talked about the market access being preventive. This is one of the problems, at least here in Europe. If you go through the studies, there is not proper definition for or design for the ancillary services from demand side to be offered. And the bid size also is a very important factor helping the demand side integration in the market, which also needs to be aligned when we are designing the ancillary service of the flexibility. So that was it. Thank you, Jessie, for the brief summary on the votes. We can go back to slides. So for the debate session, I thought that would be nice if we could discuss over the impact of implicit versus explicit demand response and how they will affect the optimization model. Another question would be the aggregation model that we have to consider on a building level. You know, when we are calculating the flexibility, there is a profile of each appliance, and there's an aggregated model for the building, and then extended, this is an aggregated model of the cluster of buildings. So how this should affect when we are calculating the flexibility or the consumption profile, that is something that we are also investigating. And another part is that when we are presenting a complex model, how we can be sure that ESCOs will take this and use it in their business. I don't know if there's any questions in the chat box, Jessie, or please, if you have any ideas, let's discussion now, or send us your inputs, your insights that will help us on shaping this module that we are developing and shaping our platform, how we will make it, which is going to be later on the basis for further regulatory recommendations to improve the energy performance contracting and demand side flexibility in Europe.
Hi, Niloufar.
Hi.
First of all, hope you're doing well.
Thank you.
With the discussion, the first part, the implicit versus the explicit demand response, actually, it's kind of, maybe it takes also a lot of time. I think we should consider at the first stage, I don't know, at this stage, have you already considered any kind of these models into your optimization model yet?
Yes, we have some kind of constraints being added and some terms added to the objective function for the optimization model, but this is still on a trial period. Do you have any ideas?
Yeah, I think at least at this stage, maybe it's better to consider the explicit demand response because I think if you consider the implicit, it can increase the complexity of the optimization model significantly. Maybe the users, because the users in the implicit demand response, they can interact directly and they can adjust their loads based on the market. And yeah, we don't know how they may respond because the users, maybe they don't have enough knowledge to somehow manage their loads and manage somehow their flexibility and energy performance based on the market. And maybe there's another, okay, for example, they want to shift the loads and maybe there's another peak at some, for example, at the midnight. And I think the explicit one is better at this stage because the aggregator is, in this case, the aggregator is somehow a middleware and it can manage the variation and all the loads and of course with all the consumers that connected to the aggregator, it can manage better because it has both the knowledge and the resource to manage this. But I think with the implicit demand response, it will be more hard. Yeah, actually, I want to say a bit harder, but I think way more harder in the implicit demand response to, at least in this stage, to consider this in the optimization model.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for your input. That's actually true. That's actually true. But that's that's the challenge. If we have any kind of simplification or compromise when we want to include implicit demand response. That's what we are hoping for. Of course, it's also requires the interaction that the ESCO will have with the aggregator, or how this the business case is going to be shaped. Not necessarily all demand response options are going to be used for one case. So having an optimization model that consider them separately, of course, it's an option. But what if we were going to deal with a case that wants to have both, because they have two different beneficiaries? So that's where the complexity comes into shape. And I also mentioned this conflicts between the beneficiaries when it comes to demand response. This is nothing that we can answer with an optimization model, of course, but it will have a counter effect on the mathematical modeling for us too.
Yeah, that's true.
Thank you, Ellie. Thank you for your input.
Anytime.
So I've seen a question in the chat box regarding the complexity of the model with the ESCO, if I'm not mistaken. If Jess, can you please read the question?
Yes, definitely. So how complex can the model be for an ESCO to take up? They can only spend about 1 day to make an offer.
That is actually a very good question. What we are developing in AmBIENCE project and an Active Building EPC, we are also considering the process of implementing an active EPC. So we have to take into account the timeline. For example, they will have 1 or 2 weeks for the initial negotiation, that they will have 1 week, for example, for analysis, 1 month for the commissioning of the it has a timeline. Of course, this is not a strict timeline. It is different based on the ESCOs. This is one of the selling points for the ESCOs when they want to attract the user. For example, they're going to say, okay, I'm going to bring you a business case in 1 week, in 2 days, something like that. It is different. So this is the input that we somehow need some reflections we need from the ESCOs, that how they prefer for them to be the timeline for this kind of calculations. This will help us to consider what should be the effort or the burden for this calculation. That is one part. Another part is that if we go to too much detail, too much complex, too much technical engine, this may not even interest them. We are dealing with, so there is a margin of accuracy and there is a margin of complexity that is accepted, is in the accepted range for the ESCOs, because they have to talk money, they have to talk the business case alongside the technical aspect of it. Also, flexibility calculation is the basis for them, but there is a margin of acceptance. That's why I think it is important to have some inputs from the ESCO's point of view that could help us to see what should be the margin, the acceptable margin, let's say. I see another question. The ABAPEM platform be adjustable, meaning can the ESCO choose the level of complexity? We do not see that. we want to have a model that would take some inputs and run based on those inputs. So what happens is that, for example, on a case by case, we will have different inputs. Not all cases will require installation of PV panels. Not all cases will require electric vehicles, for example. So these are the things that would differ between cases. And this is the option that the ESCO will have. Okay, I'm going to have this input, that input. The other thing that's still an ongoing question, and that was also the point of discussion previously with Ellie, is the fact that if we should give the option of choosing over implicit demand response, explicit demand response, both, none, this kind of things. But not too much adjustability is being assumed for AmBIENCE platform, rather than the inputs that will be used for running the program, not the model itself.
Great. So we do have some more questions in the chat box.
Uh-huh.
Why do you say that implicit DR model increases the complexity of the optimization versus explicit DR?
Okay, I would like to have, to make some discussions here. I don't know, Ellie, if you would like to answer this question.
Yeah, I can answer it. Yeah, because I think with the implicit one, where there are a lot of users that they can interact to the network and they can interact to the market. So there will be a lot of players. So somehow managing this tons of players, tons of consumers who take part, it can be hard to manage. But with the explicit DR, when there is aggregator and a bunch of users that are connected to the aggregator has both sources and the knowledge to first manage, and then it's somehow, I think it's let's consider it as a grid, and when the grid is smaller, I think in my opinion, I think when for example, the number of you see the number of loads that you can control, if it's higher, then for example the frequency control is easier. It's the same. For example, when there is implicit DR, you have just one, you are just one user, and you can just control one thing, one load, that is your own load. But when the explicit DR, you have lots of load and you can control and manage them easily. Beside of this fact, I think maybe each user, they don't have the same perspective as we do, because we know the market somehow, we know the electrical grid, and we know other aspects, but the individuals, they don't know this by heart, and they don't have the knowledge to do this. For example, they say, okay, at this time the market price is low, so I will consume this and that and this and that, and boom, at this moment there will be a peak, a peak that the operators, the ESO, the market even don't expect that. So I think it's better to if we want to consider the implicit DR, then we need to model the behavior of the users and the load pattern. For example, even with the very simple thing like load pattern, it can be very complicated to forecast the loads. But you want to consider DR, market, and each individual can interact with the market. It can be very, very complex to consider it in the optimization model. This is my point of view. I don't know if you have any other views, and we can discuss on it. Okay, Nilu, it's done.
But that's that is somehow correct, because when we are dealing with implicit demand response, we are talking about reactions towards towards the price signals, right? It depends on the extent of you know, a demand response program that we want to talk about. If we want to just say like price-based price-based formation of the profile, right? It can be, it may not be that complex, but if we want to say, for example, we want to have some kind of this reaction analysis towards, you know, how the user will behave in the market, yes, that would add to the complexity. But for example, with the explicit demand response, when you are defining a set of incentives for changing the load or changing the profile, it can be more straightforward rather than, you know, optimizing with the price if we are dealing with like actually offering this in the market, or you want to decide on the profile based on the market prices. Thank you again, Ellie, and thank you, Ricardo, for the question. If we do not have more questions, we can move forward to the next slide, which is our finalizing slides. Once again, I thank you all for your participation and your interest in our project, but I would like also to ask you to go through our website and go through the content that we have already provided on the website, and also join our stakeholder group. By becoming our stakeholder, you will have an updated and easier access to our developments. You will be prioritized to have access to our achievements. You will have access to these proof of concept models that we are developing for valorizing the building flexibility, and it would also be in touch with the other stakeholders in the network of ESCOs and energy related stakeholders, aggregators. So it will put you in the spotlight of energy related and flexibility related beneficiaries. I would also like to ask you to take time and participate in our surveys for flexibility. We have two surveys, one for flexibility providers and another one for flexibility requesters. These are two surveys that we have developed as a part of analyzing the status of different member states on the flexibility acquisition, and how what are the requirements for providing flexibility for the end users. So as I've said, this is one for the flexibility providers and another one for flexibility requesters. So it has two different points of view. One is the demand side, that how they are providing flexibility, and the other side is for those, for example, aggregators and so on, who will want to use this flexibility and request this flexibility. Our next webinar is going to, and this is going to be the final webinar of the series, going to be exploring the business model and opportunity for the Active Building EPC. It's going to happen on June 29th. If you haven't registered yet, please, you can check it on our website and participate in that webinar. If you're interested to know more about the business side of Active Building EPC, what are the stakeholders, how this flexibility is going to be interacted from the ESCOs to aggregators, to the technical aggregator or market aggregator, and also the very important aspect of measurement and verification, do not hesitate to register for our next webinar. that was it. That was my presentation for today. I once again thank you all for your participation, and thank you for your active participation in the polls. These are going to help us on how to shape our activities in a way that best serve the need and premises of our audience, which are you, of course. And if you think that you have other inputs or you have doubts or questions, do not hesitate to contact me or my colleagues in this consortium. You can go through our website. There are lots of contents that are there. You can subscribe to our newsletter and we'll receive more updates about our latest news, our latest events. Also, do not forget to follow us on our social media. We usually not only inform about our activities, but we have informative content regarding the energy performance contractive and active buildings that we post on social media. So that was it. I also thank Jesse and Roberta for their support for today's webinar. If there is no more questions, we can close this webinar.
Yeah, thank you all very much for joining, and please feel free to reach out to Nilofer or myself or anyone else in the consortium.